.an. Words in italics, with singular quotation marks for this chapter are Sabo's thoughts, while those without are just for emphasis. I've included another original character named Oyoroi, a play on a Japanese word which I think means great armor, and which was worn by Japanese samurai. Correct me if I use terms or phrases incorrectly. There will also be a non-canon death mentioned. Again, there will be minor cursing. Enjoy. The conference room, 1300 hours. Sabo sat across from Dragon at the large oval table, in the center of the room, scowling. Sabo felt the heat of their earlier confrontation rising. Ivankov sat at the table to Dragon's right and Sabo's left, his huge face wearing that familiar grin, her face. Their face. Soon, Hack and Koala, now dressed in her usual attire, came through the door. The two managed to carry themselves with dignity and professionalism, in spite of their obvious weariness from the last 2 weeks of grueling punishment, as they took seats beside Sabo with Koala closest. Sabo would never admit it, but he greatly admired his companions' stoicism in the face of adversity, and in Koala's case, often with a smile. He felt his earlier anger dissipating, just slightly, replaced by another familiar heat. She turned to face him and flashed him a warm, if slightly awkward smile. He blinked, realizing he had been staring, tried to return her smile which came as more of a grimace, gave up and determinedly looked to Dragon who was still scowling. The familiar heat did not fade from his cheeks. Shortly afterwards, the five were joined by three more that Sabo knew mostly by reputation, but still with presentation that drew all eyes to them, as they took seats to Dragon's left. The sixth visitor, closest to Dragon, a tall middle-aged man with light olive skin and slightly slanted eyes, he was rumored to have ties to Wano. Apart from that, Sabo knew he was called Oyoroi, that he had the power of the Tate no Mi, shield fruit, a devil fruit I made up, and that years ago he had been a decorated rear admiral for the Navy. That was until his platoon was assigned to guard a particular world noble in Sabaudi. Until he committed an unforgivable sin. When he shot that same world noble in the head in broad daylight. The official version was that the old veteran had suffered a mental breakdown after years of fighting pirates and, even after an unprovoked attack on said noble, would be receiving the best medical care available, only to die while in intensive care soon afterwards. Then there was the unsubstantiated rumor that this world noble was going to execute the daughter of an offending slave right in front of him, as an example with a gun to the head, the same way, it said, a pirate killed the admiral's own son. Rumor also had it he used his powers to hold off his own platoon so the slave and daughter could rob the noble's corpse of the keys to his shackles and make their escape. In any case, Oyoroi had not been sent to intensive care. He was captured and, instead of being sent to Eni's lobby for court-martialing and ultimately impelled down, he was taken by the noble's husband, a second cousin of St. Charles or something, for a far worse fate. Since then the man's existence was another kind of hell as a slave of Mariajoy, right up until Sabo's last visit when he found and rescued the former Marine. Sabo guessed that the Navy had its reasons for unceremoniously handing over one of their own to a world noble's whims, apart from being spineless sellouts. Letting people think that this was not a random, isolated incident but a deliberate strike, by an admiral of all people, against the higher powers, and against the very concept of justice that the Navy supposedly exists for. That might just shake up the political hierarchy enough to throw the entire world into chaos. And gods forbid those higher powers having to do things for themselves. That said, although Sabo didn't regret any of the slaves he liberated, it would be a stretch to say he actually liked the guy. Considering his position on pirates, whom perhaps he hated just slightly less now than the nobles, and the navy that forsook him, Sabo still wasn't entirely sure of the man's true allegiances. And speaking of stretches, if he ever met Sabo's brother, things would get interesting. Then there was the seventh and eighth visitors to Oyoroi's left, who needed no introduction. Mostly because the seventh was a giant duck, who nestled beside the left of his mistress, and the blue-haired beauty had her own reputation for riling up the world government, something Sabo highly respected. Dragon was the first to speak with a raspy growl. Gentlemen, ladies. Company, glad I'm not the only one who gets confused with gender pronouns around Ivankov. I trust you're all familiar with our newest operatives, Oyoroi and her ladyship, Princess Nefertari. Thank you, Director, though I'm not sure the title really applies right now, just call me Vivi. Princess, queen, or not, the Bluenet sure had the air of a true ruler, someone who actually cares for her subjects. The duck inclined his head and quacked softly, apparently affirming his approval of her response. They were all well aware of the official reports by now of the death of King Nefertari Cobra of Arabasta in the heart of Mariajoy, as well as the death of the esteemed Saint Dunkiot Njosgard, and that the prime suspect for their murders was Dragon Claw Sabo, of the Revolutionary Army. Everyone present in that room was also aware that those reports were complete swear word. One person in that room knew exactly WHO murdered her father and barely escaped alive with that truth. All nothing more than a world government cover for the death of the king and perhaps one of very few world nobles who dared to question their sovereignty and their divinity. The perfect excuse to take the missing princess, should she reappear, into the government's protective custody, the surest way to keep her from sharing the truth with the world. And the perfect fuel to throw on the already blazing fire being stoked by some of the world against the army, all but assuring the government's continued absolute rule. Since that day, with the power vacuum left by the royal family's absence, Arabasta had become a navy-occupied state. And Sabo couldn't quite bring himself to look the princess in the eye, weighed down as he was by guilt, knowing he was partly responsible for its happening. They both knew he hadn't directly caused the good king's death, but he had been sneaking around the Holy Palace on his own mission of espionage the day it happened. Could he have saved the king if he was paying more attention? How exactly was he supposed to say to the woman who was already suffering from the groaning of her homeland, "Sorry, my half-assed sneaking got your dad killed"? Her gaze drifted towards Sabo's scarred eye as she gave him a small sympathetic smile he knew he didn't deserve. Where stories live. Discover now.